The surveyor's stakes disappeared first, 12 of them, painted orange, driven into the soft ground at the edge of Mara Voss's lower field sometime in early October. And when she walked out to look at them on a Tuesday morning with frost still on the grass and her breath coming in small white clouds, she already knew what they meant. And she already knew what was coming. And she already knew that no one was going to listen to her. She was 22 years old. She had been farming this land with her mother for 4 years, since her mother's hip gave out and the physical work shifted to Mara by default, not by plan. The farm sat in a hollow in the foothills of the Catskills, in Greene County, New York, about 12 miles east of Catskill town itself. 83 acres, most of it workable, with a creek called Blind Run threading through the lower third of the property. Above the farm, on the north-facing slope, there had always been trees. Second-growth hardwood, mostly red maple and yellow birch, with some hemlock stands along the ridgeline. Dense enough that in summer you couldn't see 20 feet into them. Dense enough that when rain fell on that slope, it fell slowly, filtered through canopy and duff and root mat, and arrived at Blind Run as a steady trickle rather than a rush. The trees had been there for at least 80 years. A company called Ridgeline Development Group had bought that slope in August. But to understand what happened the following March, you need to understand something about how water moves through a landscape, and you need to understand why Mara Voss knew it when almost no one else around her did. If you've been watching this channel for a while, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Mara had not gone to college. She had finished high school in Coxsackie and then come home, because the farm needed her and because, if she was honest, she had never been particularly interested in leaving. What she had done, starting around age 16, was read. Not casually. She had a habit of going to the county library in Catskill and pulling books off the shelves in clusters: hydrology, soil science, forest ecology, and sitting with them at the long table by the window for whole Saturday afternoons. The librarian, a woman named Dolores Perez who had worked there for 27 years, told me once that Mara was the only patron she'd ever seen take notes in a separate notebook while reading a library book. Not highlights, not dog ears, a separate notebook with page references and diagrams. The farm had flooded twice in Mara's memory. Once in 2011, during Hurricane Irene, which flooded half of the Hudson Valley and was broadly considered an act of God. Once in 2017, during a wet spring, when Blind Run rose about 18 inches and covered the lower pasture for 3 days. That second flood had interested Mara more than the first, because there had been no hurricane, just a wet March, and when she walked the property afterward, she noticed that the water had come from a specific direction and had moved in a specific pattern that didn't quite match the obvious topography. She spent the better part of that summer walking the slope above the farm, the slope that would later belong to Ridgeline Development, and tracing where the water went. What she found, over months of careful observation, was a shallow, subsurface drainage system that no one had ever mapped. The slope had 3 natural swales, low channels in the terrain, subtle enough that you'd miss them walking quickly, that converged near the northeast corner of her lower field. When the hemlock stands at the top of the slope were wet, they released water slowly, and the swales carried it down in a manageable flow. But the swales were not ditches. They were depressions in the mineral soil, lined with root mat and organic material, and their capacity to move water without flooding depended entirely on that mat remaining intact. Remove the trees, compact the soil with machinery, and those swales would stop functioning as filters. They would become channels. She had read about this dynamic in detail in a 2005 paper by forest hydrologists Kevin McGuire and Jeffrey McDonnell, published in the journal Water Resources Research, which described how subsurface lateral flow in forested hill slopes depended on the continuity of what they called preferential flow paths, essentially the routes that water had carved through decades of root growth and organic accumulation. Disturb those paths, and water that had moved slowly and underground would move fast and overland instead. Mara did not use the phrase preferential flow paths in her letters to Ridgeline Development Group. She used words like drainage patterns and subsurface channels and historic flooding risk, but the knowledge behind those words was precise. She wrote the first letter on the 9th of October, 3 days after she found the surveyor's stakes. She addressed it to the registered agent of Ridgeline Development Group, a man named Paul Carver, whose name appeared on the county deed transfer filings. She described the location of the farm, the location of Blind Run, the position of the 3 swales relative to the proposed development footprint, and what she believed would happen to her lower field if the slope above was cleared and graded. She kept a copy. She noted the date she sent it and the method: certified mail, return receipt requested. The receipt came back signed. A signature she didn't recognize, but signed. She heard nothing. November was cold and dry, which was almost a relief because it meant nothing would happen, yet. Ridgeline's crew came up the logging road on the ridge in the second week of November with 2 feller bunchers and a skidder and started taking the timber. Mara could hear the machines from the lower field when the wind was right, a low mechanical grinding that carried down the slope in the morning and then was gone by late afternoon when they stopped for the day. She walked the fence line at the top of her property on a Sunday in mid-November and looked up through the remaining trees at the raw, brown swaths of disturbed ground. The hemlock stands along the ridgeline were gone already. She could see sky where she hadn't been able to see sky before. She wrote a second letter on November 18th. This one she addressed not only to Paul Carver, but to Ridgeline's attorney of record, whose name she found in the County Planning Board minutes from the development's preliminary approval hearing the previous spring. She had gone to the county clerk's office and requested those minutes in person, which had taken 2 trips because the first time the relevant file was misfiled. She was specific in the second letter. She described the 3 swales by compass bearing and approximate distance from her northern fence line. She described the 2017 flood event and the water level it had produced, and she estimated, based on her measurements of the slope's drainage area and the projected impervious surface from Ridgeline's grading plan, which was also in the public planning file, that a significant rain or snowmelt event following full clearing would produce runoff approximately 2 to 3 times greater than what Blind Run had handled in 2017. She sent that letter certified mail. She kept a copy. She noted the date. The return receipt came back signed. Again, she heard nothing. December brought a week of hard rain in the middle of the month, and Mara walked Blind Run afterward and measured the water level with a staff gauge she had installed at the downstream end of her property, a painted wooden post driven into the stream bed with horizontal lines marked in inches. In a normal December rain, the creek ran at about 14 to 16 inches against the gauge. After this rain, with roughly half the slope above her cleared, it ran at 22 inches. Nothing flooded, but Mara wrote the number in her notebook and underlined it. She understood something that the Ridgeline engineers apparently did not, or did not think mattered. The slope above her farm was not just the source of water during a storm. It was the primary recharge zone for a shallow, perched aquifer that fed Blind Run between storms. The trees had been regulating that aquifer for decades, drawing water up through transpiration in summer, releasing it slowly through their root systems in spring. Without them, the aquifer would lose its buffer. The creek would go from dry in August to violent in March, with much less in between. Albert Bates and colleagues had described this buffering mechanism in agricultural terms in their work on permaculture hydrology, but the clearest articulation Mara had found was in an older text, Luna Leopold's A View of the River, published by Harvard University Press in 1994, where Leopold, one of the foundational figures in American river science, described how forested catchments produced what he called flashiness dampening, the ability of a healthy watershed to spread a precipitation event across time, releasing water days and weeks after a rain rather than hours after. Remove the forest, and you remove the dampening. The hydrograph, the curve of streamflow over time, goes from a long, shallow arc to a sharp spike. Mara's lower field sat directly in the path of that spike. She wrote a third letter in January, this time also sending a copy to the Greene County Soil and Water Conservation District. She attached a hand-drawn map of the swales with estimated drainage area calculations, which she had worked out using topographic data from the county GIS portal and a set of basic equations from a United States Geological Survey technical manual on small watershed hydrology. The calculations were not sophisticated. They did not need to be. They showed clearly that the convergent zone at the northeast corner of her lower field would receive, during a 100-year storm event, a volume of runoff roughly equivalent to filling 3 Olympic swimming pools within 6 hours. The Soil and Water Conservation District sent a form letter back acknowledging receipt. They were, the letter said, not in a position to intervene in private land use decisions. Ridgeline Development Group said nothing. By February, the slope was fully cleared. Mara could stand at her kitchen window and see it. Raw brown earth, a few slash piles still smoking from the burn piles they lit in January. The faint parallel lines of skid trails running down toward the ridge. The ground up there was frozen, which was the only thing keeping it in place. She wrote 2 more letters in February, including one addressed directly to the project manager whose name appeared on the construction trailer that had been placed near the logging road. She drove up to the road and copied the name off the trailer herself. His name was Dennis Farwell. Dennis Farwell did not respond. In her notebook, by the end of February, Mara had 9 letters documented, each with a date, a recipient, a delivery method, and a notation of whether a return receipt had come back. 7 return receipts had come back signed. 2 letters had gone unanswered by the Postal Service as well, which she also noted. The notebook itself was a standard composition book, black and white cover, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $2. She kept it on the kitchen table, next to the window that faced north, so she could see the slope when she opened it. March came in warm, warmer than usual, temperatures in the low 50s by the second week, which was early enough that the frost hadn't finished leaving the ground when the snowpack on the ridge started going. Mara watched the creek on the morning of March 14th and noted in her notebook that Blind Run was running at 26 inches against the gauge and the water was carrying a lot of silt, the milky brown color that meant topsoil was moving somewhere upstream. She moved her mother's car to the upper driveway. She moved the portable water pump from the barn to the front porch. She stacked sandbags at the entrance to the equipment shed, which sat on the lowest ground of the property. She did not sandbag the lower field. There was no point. The lower field was going to flood, and she had accepted that, and she had spent the last 5 months trying to prevent it, and no one had helped her. On the night of March 15th, the temperature dropped to 31 degrees, and then rose to 48 by dawn, and 0.8 of an inch of rain fell in the 6 hours between 2 and 8 in the morning. It was not a 100-year storm. It was not even a 50-year storm. It was a moderately heavy March rain on ground that was already saturated and a slope that had lost every tree that had been slowing water down for 80 years. Mara was awake before the creek crested. She stood on the porch in her barn coat with a flashlight and watched the water come across the lower field in a thin sheet that thickened as she watched, rising from ankle depth to knee depth over the course of about 40 minutes. Blind Run had jumped its banks entirely and was running across the field surface in braided channels, carrying the fine topsoil that the slope above had contributed and depositing it in uneven fans. The northeast corner, exactly where the 3 swales converged, exactly where she had described it to Paul Carver in October, to his attorney in November, to Dennis Farwell in February, was running deepest. But the water didn't stop at her fence line. This is the part that Ridgeline's project engineers had apparently not modeled. The slope above the farm was not just a drainage area for Blind Run. It was also the upslope boundary of Ridgeline's own construction site. The grading they had done over the winter had leveled a pad for the first phase of a 40-unit residential development. 12 acres of smoothed, compacted earth sitting at a slight angle on the hillside, with a temporary sediment pond that was supposed to catch runoff before it left the property. The sediment pond was designed for a 10-year storm event. The engineers had filed the calculations with the county. Mara had read those calculations in the planning file. She had written about the sediment pond in her 4th letter, in December. She had pointed out that the drainage area contributing to the pond had been substantially underestimated because the county topographic data the engineers had used did not reflect 2 decades of road construction on the ridge that had altered the natural drainage divides. The actual contributing area was larger than the model assumed. The pond was undersized. When the rain hit on the morning of March 16th, the sediment pond filled in approximately 90 minutes and then overtopped its berm. The berm was composed of compacted fill, and once water began running over its lip, the erosion was rapid. Within 2 hours, the berm had failed in 2 places, releasing the accumulated runoff and sediment load across Ridgeline's construction pad in a sheet that carved channels up to 3 feet deep across the graded surface, relocated approximately 200 tons of fill material down the slope, buried the foundation formwork for the first 4 building lots under 18 inches of mixed mud and gravel, and destroyed the access road to the site so thoroughly that the construction crew, when they arrived at 7:30 in the morning, couldn't get their vehicles past the first turn. A man named Greg Ostrowski, a site superintendent from a general contracting firm Ridgeline had hired, called Paul Carver from the road at 7:45 that morning. I found out about that call from Ostrowski himself, who had no particular reason to stay loyal to the story Ridgeline would later try to tell. Ostrowski told me that Carver's first question was whether anyone had warned them this could happen. Ostrowski said he didn't know. Carver said to find out. Mara was still on her porch when Ostrowski drove down the county road and turned into her driveway at around 9 in the morning, picking his way around the standing water in the lower drive. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, wearing Carhartt work pants and a fleece vest, and he looked at the flooded lower field and then looked at Mara and said, without preamble, that he was trying to understand what had happened up the hill. She brought him inside. She made coffee. She opened the composition book on the kitchen table and let him read it. He didn't say much while he read. He turned the pages slowly, going through each letter notation with its date and its recipient and its return receipt status. He looked at the hand-drawn swale map she had taped into the notebook in January. He looked at the drainage area calculations in her handwriting. He was quiet for a long time. "How old are you?" he finally asked. 22, Mara said. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're doing math they don't like the answer to. Ostrowski told Carver about the notebook. Carver called Ridgeline's attorney. The attorney called Mara's phone 4 days later, and that conversation was the first time anyone from Ridgeline Development Group had spoken to her directly in the 9 months since she had sent the first letter. The attorney's name was Sandra Villanueva, and she was careful on the phone, professionally careful, the kind of careful that tells you a calculation is being made on the other end. She asked if Mara had documentation. Mara said she had 9 letters, 7 signed return receipts, a notebook of field measurements going back to the previous October, and photographs of the creek gauge taken on 12 separate dates. There was a pause. "I see," said Villanueva. The legal settlement took 11 months to finalize. Mara didn't discuss the terms in detail when I spoke with her, and I didn't push. What she did say was that the remediation work Ridgeline funded on the lower field included reestablishing the 3 swales with engineered check dams, replanting the buffer strip along the northern fence line with native shrubs, and installing a properly sized sediment control structure that actually reflected the real drainage area of the slope. The work was designed by a hydrological engineer from Albany, a woman named Dr. Patricia Cho, who read Mara's original drainage calculations and told her, apparently without much ceremony, that they were essentially correct. The lower field was back in production the following summer. Mara planted it in winter squash, a crop that tolerates some moisture but needs decent drainage, and by August the vines were running, and the fruit was setting, and the ground was firm underfoot in a way it hadn't been for years, because the check dams and the swales were holding water back long enough for it to percolate rather than rush. A neighbor, Tom Elber, who ran beef cattle on the adjoining property to the east and had watched the whole situation with the particular detached interest of someone who is glad the trouble is not his, stopped his truck on the road one afternoon in late August, when Mara was working the edge of the field. He leaned out the window and looked at the squash, and looked at the rebuilt swales, and looked at the young shrubs along the fence line, barely knee-high still, but already thickening. "Heard you gave 'em some trouble," he said. "They gave themselves the trouble," Mara said. "I just wrote it down." Elber thought about that. 9 letters, he said. 9 letters. He drove on. She went back to work. Her mother was sitting on the porch when Mara came in that evening, and the light was long and golden the way it gets in the Catskills in late August when the summer is starting to think about ending, and the creek was running low and clear the way it was supposed to run in August, not dry, not flooding, just steady. Her mother asked how the field looked. Mara said it looked fine. Her mother said good and went back to the book she was reading. The composition notebook was still on the kitchen table. It had a second notebook next to it now, also black and white, also from the drugstore. Mara had started it in April, after the settlement talks began, because old habits are hard to break, and because she had learned, in a very concrete way, that writing things down was not a bureaucratic formality, but something closer to a form of power. The power of a record that exists independent of anyone's memory or goodwill. There is a concept in watershed science called connectivity, the degree to which water, sediment, and energy can move through a landscape without interruption. Luna Leopold spent decades writing about what happens to rivers when human beings interrupt that connectivity without understanding what they're interrupting. The water doesn't disappear. It doesn't obey property lines or project timelines or the financial assumptions in a developer's pro forma. It goes somewhere. It always goes somewhere. Mara Voss knew where it was going to go. She wrote it down 9 times. The notebook is still on the table. Kevin McGuire and Jeffrey McDonnell. Hydrological connectivity of hill slopes and streams. Characteristic timescales and nonlinearities. Water Resources Research, 2005.